Greetings and welcome. Is this really loud? No, gosh. My name's Amanda Wojcik, and I am a professor in the Department of Art and co-curricular head of the sculpture area. And I am presenting this introduction on behalf of Jovencio de la Paz, my colleague, who was unable to attend, but they were kind enough to provide this. It is a distinct pleasure to introduce you to our visiting artist and distinguished alumni, Sarah Nance. Sarah received her MFA from the University of Oregon in 2013, and her visit coincides with a special exhibition at the Laverne Krause Gallery across the hall, titled For Evaporated Seas, on view now and made possible by the Laverne Krause Lectures and Exhibitions Endowment. We will have a reception immediately following this talk from 5 to 6, so please come and look at the work and talk with Sarah. Thank you for visiting with our class today, too. Sarah Nance is an interdisciplinary artist working across sculpture, installation, textile processes, performance, and other media. Her work takes on notions of landscape and human experience as it is archived simultaneously in material, geological, and speculative terrains. It is hard sometimes to see the clear relationships between fiber and geology, and yet, when faced with those elements of humankind's touch upon the material world, we begin to see the poetics of accumulation, of pressurized time, of rupture and intimacy as shared vernaculars, one happening on the timescale of a lifespan, the other in incalculable metrics. Perhaps it is that cloth and geology frame a human life between what can be touched and what is ungraspable. And in that opposition, an artist can find a place to view expanses too big and moments too small for any other process, any other scrutiny. Sarah Nance has exhibited her projects both nationally and internationally, most recently at venues in China, France, Canada, Iceland, South Korea, Germany, and Italy, as well as across the US. Sarah is currently an assistant professor of integrated practice in the Harper College of Arts and Sciences at SUNY Binghamton in New York. She has previously held professorships in interdisciplinary art at SMU in Dallas, Texas, fibers and material practices at Concordia University in Montreal, and fiber at Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond, Virginia. Please join me in welcoming Sarah Nance.
Thanks. I think I have my own. Perfect. It's really great to be back. Exciting to see you and be able to share my work. I also just want to say thank you to all of the gallery interns and Jonathan Bagby for helping me put the show up in such a short period of time and get the space ready. And it's been great to work with everybody. So I'm mostly going to be talking about my work and research from the last several years, but I'm going to start by moving through slides of some older work by way of introduction to my practice in general and what's important to me as a maker. And this was actually in Eugene at the Wave Gallery, I think now Eugene Contemporary Art, but maybe they're in a new space now. I have a background in fiber processes and have taught that at several institutions, from printing and dyeing to weaving to experimental and expansive practices that include performance, installation, and site-responsive work. I also have a long history of fiber traditions in my own family. I learned to knit, embroider, crochet, and even cane chairs from members of my family. And this is my great-grandmother's 1910 Singer 66 sewing machine. It's a treadle machine. And I brought it back to my home after going back to visit my parents during the pandemic and discovering that their mail table was a sewing machine. And all the machine stitched work that I'll show in the lecture is made on this machine. I was really, this is also my sister who's here today. I was very influenced by place. I grew up in the driftless region of the Midwest, which is sort of right in the northeast corner of Iowa, crossing a bit into Minnesota and Wisconsin. It's characterized by a karst topography, meaning there's a lot of sinkholes and disappearing streams and cave systems. And as you can see, there's also quite a bit of exposed limestone and many marine fossils to be found in this limestone. And it's influenced my work significantly. I also was a tour guide at Niagara Cave, also in the region. So I spent quite a bit of time underground. And so I think I was very influenced by all this time spent observing the exposed geologic strata, both above and below the surface level. And I will say one more thing about this. So this combination of the history of my family experience with textiles and this close connection to the geology where I grew up is part of what led me to become interested in the ways that textiles can start to bridge the gap between human and geologic scales of time. I think textiles are very uniquely suited to this, such that accumulative processes like weaving or beading can be akin to sedimentation, reductive processes like drawn thread work, similar to erosion, and loop structures as ways of moving through a landscape, which I'll say more about later. The Shroud for an Ancient Sea series, which is most of the work I'll talk about today, arose from my attention to what I call archived landscapes, or landscapes that have had multiple distinct geologic identities over time. And many of those identities now observable only through fossil records, artifacts, or recorded data. The archived landscapes that I've worked with have included a subsurface meteor crater, fossilized reefs, and an exhumed mountain range. These landscapes, of course, are often also settled by people and therefore have this entwining of cityscapes and human activity with the geologic strata. The site-responsive shrouds that I make in relation to these places vary from expansive textiles to experimental vocal performances. And my intention is for them to act as surface layers that point to the complex records of deep time within these landscapes. The first of these shrouds were a series of quilted sculptures. And apart from this particular piece, which is in the gallery, and this piece is stitched into a single surface. The others were made modularly of individual diamond sections that I can combine and remix to create different iterations of a singular landscape, and then also to mix with one another to create composite and speculative landscapes. This piece and the next several works are based on elements of the Beartooth Pass in Montana. And just a note about the pattern itself. I landed on the Lone Star pattern for a couple reasons. One is that I had a Lone Star quilt that my great-grandmother had made, and it's her sewing machine that I'm using to make these works. And also that I started with this reflection on the Beartooth Pass, which is named after a very jagged, kind of diamond-like structure. And so I was exploring that with this diamond structure of the quilt. The quilts are made from mylar, which is a material, of course, used in space exploration, temperature regulation, and party decorations. And because of these really variable uses, I think mylar has the ability to communicate the innovative, hubristic, and also very banal ways that humans interact with or enact upon the environment. Part of this Shroud for an Ancient Sea series, the quilts capture distinct layers of the environment, some of which have yet to become part of the geologic stratum. So I think of these as future ancient seas. The colors of this particular piece are taken from the summer wildflowers on top of the pass. And the colors of this work capture the moss, lichen, and granite at the base of the pass. And this is an example of those two terrains in one particular installation mixed into a composite landscape. I use collected data in multiple ways in my work. And while in some of the other works, many of the other works that I'll share today, I reference scientific data that's been collected by other people, here I'm collecting via my own observations and documentation. And what you're looking at now is part of my research notes, collecting colors from the top of the pass of these wildflowers in an app called Quilt Paper. So while I was on top of the pass, I used that app to record the colors that I was seeing as closely as I could. And then back in the studio, I arranged those colors according to my memory of the fields. And so it's moving between scales. So the silver aspects of the star that have that pink and a little bit yellow center are one particular flower that I saw, while the blue and green and oranges are more a reflection on kind of the proportions of color that I was seeing out on these fields. I also collect information through photographs and did that for the lichen here. And overlaid the template of the star and traced the colors through. So this one was made in quite a different way. It's really capturing an image rather than sort of a remembered impression of the place. And that's the final piece. Another way that I think about shrouds and strata and layers is through sound. This particular piece is called Marseille Tidal Gauge Aria. It's composed from tide level data that was collected over about 130 years from a tidal gauge in the Bay of Marseille, France. So from 1884 to 2014. I converted each yearly average tide level into an individual note within my vocal range. And so the rising levels of the tide can be heard in the increasingly higher pitches of the aria. And I get a lot of questions about this particular data translation, so I'm just going to essentially give you the same info in another way in case that also helps make it a little clearer. But I took the entire span of the range of data points and the entire range of my own voice and kind of fiddled with them until the proportions between each could be easily one mapped onto the other. So that's really that's the translation that's happening here. I performed the piece in an operatic style. I'm interested in how the genre is really designed to magnify and dramatize human emotion. And in this piece, it's centering not so much a human drama, but a geologic one. This is the text for the piece. It's a poem from Raza Yongtugen's book called Songs from the Black Moon. And I'm happy to expand on why I chose this text maybe at the end of the lecture if we have time or if you're interested in knowing more. But for now, I'm just going to play you the piece, which will take a few seconds to start, but it is coming. And the last thing I'll say about this piece before I move on is the two really high notes that are in the middle are an aberration in the data. So they were incorrectly recorded tide levels. One of the interesting things about that, to me at least, is that it very quickly becomes the norm for that area. The end of the piece ends on notes that are very much still in that range. I've also performed this work in a variety of sites. As a performer, I embody the data records of this ancient sea in a way that doesn't allow for a separation of the human and the geologic, and that also mourns the products of that entanglement. This particular performance was filmed at the Guadalupe Mountains, which is in the Permian Basin and near the Capitan Fossil Reef in Texas. And so this was set in another sort of archived landscape, another place that had once had tidal activity. So it was a very haunting experience to sing a tide into this desert, thinking about current and future impacts of the climate crisis. A second aria that I wrote is called Skagway Tidal Aria, based on tide level data from Skagway, Alaska. And for this piece, I sourced not only recorded but also predictive tidal data, sonifying levels from 1941 through 2021, and then using the predictive data through 2081. The impetus for this was that I was presenting at a conference, the 2051 Munich Climate Conference, where they were asking us all to present as if it were the year 2051. And I was convinced that at some point in my talk, I was going to say something about 30 years in the future, imagining, not remembering that I needed to be in 2051. So I figured if I went through 2081, the illusion would still hold if I slipped up. The interesting thing about, or another interesting thing about this particular data set is that while tide levels are generally globally rising, they're actually falling in Skagway currently because the glaciers are melting at such a pace that it's releasing pressure from the land faster than the water is rising. So the land is actually kind of being buoyed up because the weight is being released. And this happens this trend is expected to continue through, I think, about 2070, and then the tides will also rise in this area. And this was the text also from the same poet that I set this piece to. And then I'm just going to play the very first part of this video, filmed at Mineral Wells Fossil Park, also in Texas. It's a former dump and turned fossil park, and also part of the Permian Basin. And let's see if I can do this without it playing again. That's the bit I wanted to play for you to give you that long break between the first line and where it picks up again. There was a period of a number of years where there was no data collected. And so that was another feature of that data set that I kept in the composition of the work. I also, a couple of years ago, 2023, had a really great opportunity to work with the NASA GEODES team. GEODES stands for Geophysical Exploration of the dynamics and evolution of the solar system. And they were doing a field expedition to Flagstaff, Arizona, and they moved between actually lava beds, Monument in Oregon, this San Francisco volcanic field in, confusingly, in Arizona, and then various sites in Iceland, because these are all lunar analog landscapes. So what they're doing is testing geophysics methods like seismic and ground penetrating radar surveying, testing these methods on Earth to study and refine how those can be used on the lunar surface for the upcoming lunar mission. And they're also looking at void spaces to test the things that make them stable or not, with the goal of establishing a more long-term colony on the moon, which I find deeply dystopian, but really interesting to work with people as they're kind of interacting with these landscapes in this really specific way, like almost using these landscapes as a metaphor. Oh, sorry, and I should let you know, this is LiDAR data from the Miriam Crater Quarry, which is a quarry that's near one of the cinder cones out in the San Francisco volcanic field. And some of you, many of you might be familiar with LiDAR data, but just in case you're not, it's created, all of these little bits here are individual data points that have very specific location information attached to them. And so it looks like an image, but it really, each pixel, so to speak, comes with a lot of specific tagged information. And so in this software that I use Cloud Compare because it is free. You're able to select any of these individual points. And so these are selections from that point cloud that run along one of the crater's rims. And then it allows you to create what's called a polyline. And then I mapped that onto staff paper to create my most recent vocal piece, which is not an aria this time, but a lullaby. And I was interested in sort of making this flip from a type of singing that's very performative, and even though the intention of those works is to foreground that geologic drama, it felt like there still was a lot of attention on me as the performer. And switching it instead to a lullaby and thinking of this as an action of repair, so the ability for sound to fill this crater. And so the kind of closing the loop on this piece will be returning to the San Francisco volcanic field to perform this back into the space. Yeah, so I'll play this one, a little bit of this. Shashabai, don't you cry. Go to sleep. Go to sleep. I'm going to stop it there. You can hear the rest of it in the show if you're interested. The text that I used is from an old lullaby, and in a lot of previous works, I've been thinking about sometimes the strong emotion that I have in response to hearing a geologic fact, like that the moon is moving a few centimeters away from the Earth every year. The piece that I made in response to that was a blanket to cover the moon, to keep it warm, to keep it safe, which is kind of a ridiculous notion. And I'm kind of leaning into that in this work as well, offering all the pretty little horses to this quarry crater. And I wanted to introduce a text that's been really influential in the connections that I make between textiles and geologic processes or structures. And this is actually now a class that I teach at Binghamton, which is really fun. But in this article, the author talks about knitting as a filmic device for impending doom. So it's been used as a trope for the calm before the storm. And they talk about defining catastrophe as an event producing a subversion of the order or system of things. And this was kind of the guiding piece that I pulled from that work, which says, what is knitting but an act of faith consisting of the enclosure of a series of voids with a net that hovers on the edge of catastrophe. So that image of structure hovering on the edge of catastrophe really stuck with me. This is a letterpress print series composed of knitting patterns that I created by encoding seismic data from glacial and lunar quakes. So each of these pieces captures a point of rupture or a moment where a previous landscape transforms into a new one through this seismic activity. So I'm drawing a relationship between the catastrophic act of knitting and this seismic event. Ice quakes, which is the source of a lot of these prints, occur in glaciers because of calving events or because of pooling meltwater. And like melting glaciers, of course, knitting is always in danger of coming apart, but instead of by melting, by snagging and unraveling into formlessness. So I'm making this comparison, of course, between the tenuous nature of the knitted object and the tenuous nature of glaciers. And these prints push the structure of knitting to a point of failure. These are not actually knittable patterns. They cannot hold if knitted as they're currently constructed. So they highlight this form's inability to contain a seismic event. And then just a quick note on process for this work as well. I used a program that's called Stitch Maps to input the lace knitting instructions that I wrote based on the levels of seismic activity in a given quake. And I was looking at a seismograph of these quakes. And so if the line went up quite steeply, I used a certain stitch. If it went up steeply X amount, it was that many of that, like 3 of that stitch. So it's not a very, not a super precise system. I couldn't, for example, take this and translate it back into the seismograph, but it does capture the general motion of this line. I'm really interested in the relationship also between knitting and coding. They follow some of these same binary rules of on or off lace knitting. You're either making material or leaving a hole. And this is the change in the structure after the strongest part of the quake. So we start with this, and adding the line of the quake really scrunches it up. And just another slide to kind of underscore this similarity between knitting and code. This is what is input into stitch maps in order to get the output of that pattern. So it really has its own language here. In future iterations of this work, I'm interested in attempting sculptural realizations, even though, as I've mentioned, it really can't hold that structure. And I'm interested in performative possibilities of this work, and potentially also using them to translate human seismic activity through something like traffic or, I've also been doing a series of walks that are connected to knitting. So repeated interlocking loops are the base units that make up a structure of a knitted textile. And so I am making that connection here to these loops that I am tracing in the landscape. I found out a few years ago that in the town next to my hometown, there was a subsurface meteor crater. And this was right when I was starting to think about archived landscapes. So it was a really kind of arresting experience to find out that I'd been living next to this archived landscape my my whole life. And so I did a walk that traced the border of this crater. And it was, it was a really interesting way, or a really different way to experience this space. And I'm just going to move ahead to the next walk that I've done in this vein, and quite different from this walk because this was around the rim of a crater that's very visible in the landscape, very definitive, easy to see. And this earlier walk was more about bringing something that was not currently visible in the landscape to the observable surface. I see my paths in the landscapes as stand-ins for yarn. And so over time, as I continue this work, taking walks that trace craters or other kinds of geologic loops, I'll be performing a textile. For me, the performance of something as familiar as a textile gives me a new way to think about something that's much more difficult to access or comprehend, like geologic time. I also, a few years ago, began a series that works with mitten knitting patterns. I started this during a January term studio and teaching residency that I did at Luther College in Decorah, Iowa, where I did my undergrad. The town has a very strong Norwegian heritage, and it has the most extensive collection of Norwegian American objects and artwork. And so I was looking at a lot of these patterns while I was there. In these pieces, I'm using a pattern that is, I'm using a structure that is this sort of typical Norwegian pattern, but instead of using the traditional animal and plant motifs that have been very simplified to become kind of the generic symbol for flower or reindeer, in my patterns, I am translating very personal experiences of this place where I grew up. So for example, the woodwork that was part of my childhood home becomes these two vertical bars of the mitten here. And then the center motif is taken from lichen that's on the rocks in Baraboo, Wisconsin, which is a part of an exhumed mountain range, so another archived landscape. And then the motif here, this particular Queen Anne's lace flower that is growing in an abandoned limestone quarry. And while I was at this residency where I started this work, I asked students to read Pablo Neruda's Book of Questions and to pick a question that was interesting to them and make a work based on that question. And I also did this. I chose, and when you change the landscape, is it with bare hands or with gloves? And it was a really evocative question to me because it speaks to a kind of relationship with place and what bare hands or a mediated experience through gloves might do to affect that relationship. When I think about interacting with the landscape with bare hands, I think about having a full faculty of motion, a direct connection with the earth, and also being, through gardening, for example, and also being really vulnerable. So being open to myself potentially being harmed from this interaction. But I think of gloves as a very protective barrier that still give me that full range of motion. So if I'm interacting with the landscape with gloves on, I retain all of my ability to manipulate that space, and now I'm also protected from impact to myself. But if I change this question slightly and think about interacting with the landscape with mittens on, to me, this implies the loss of a range of motion. I never feel like I can do much when I'm wearing a mitten. So I think about that as something that could start to level the playing field or make me think about how I can restrict myself. If I'm going to engage in an activity that changes the landscape, how can I also be changed, or how could I be restricted in that process so I'm not just freely imposing on a place? And the works that I've been going through are graphite drawings. on the walls. One of the most recent ones that I've done of this is of this dried Apache plume flower casting a shadow on my field notebook while I was on the NASA residency, kind of bleeding into half of one of the thumb gussets from the knitting pattern. So you can see that the motifs that in the earlier drawings that were sort of completely contained by the mitten knitting chart are starting to break free of those confines. And so I'm still interacting with them graphically, but resisting reducing them to just a pattern to be contained. So I've been speaking a lot about archived landscapes, about what is beneath the surface, about layers of place that we can no longer see or perceive very easily. And my recent work, and by recent I mean since January, so quite recent, is starting to shift a little bit now to look at the surface itself. And this is a post that the artist Jamila McEwen made several years ago that really resonated with me, particularly this moment. She says that when she was driving through the Western landscape, I was entranced by the disorienting effect of mirages that would appear on the flat, expansive areas that had once been inland oceans. I began to wonder if the mirage is an apparition of the land remembering the past. And I was really captivated by this way of thinking of the mirage as evidence of a landscape's ability to speculate, to either recall its own histories or potentially cast itself into the future through invoking water where none currently exists. Disorientation is a defining characteristic of mirages and more broadly of shininess itself. An excerpt from this book reads, "Shininess not only disguises and distorts, it begins to dematerialize the object's surface. We lose our sense of where the surface of the shiny thing is." I've often used shiny materials in my work precisely because of the really complex visual experiences they offer and the way that they can obscure edges or boundaries. Lines, of course, are something that's very commonly used to create an edge or a boundary. It's something that I utilize often in my work, certainly as a drawing tool, but also materialized line as the basis of many fiber forms, like beaded ropes or netting or strung sequins, all originate as this materialized line or string. And so I'm really interested in how shininess might help a line appear less definitive and more mutable. One of the ways this can happen is that if something is shiny enough, an object can seem to extend beyond its actual edges or boundaries by virtue of how it's reflecting or scattering light. And now I'm going back quite a ways to when I was here. This is in the Wilkinson house. While I was doing my MFA, I was making a lot of large, complex string installations, but I also made a series of pieces that were trying to pare this work down to the essentials. And in this piece, I used a string whose reflectiveness was such that when it was hit with light, it would visually more than double in diameter. And these images really don't capture the full extent of that. But in this particular room, when the light was coming through the leaves, it created this effect of almost like droplets of water running down this string, one after the other. It's still one of my favorite works that I've made. I think all of my classmates really hated it because we had to come in at a special time to see the light coming in through the window. Another thing I'm thinking of in this new direction is the fact that many geographic lines are currently in flux due to the effects of climate change. Coastlines are a prime example, as are retreating glaciers. So this text is exploring how Italy's land border is being redefined because of the snowfields and glaciers that were used to, this watershed was used to define the border. They're melting and changing place as a result of climate change. And so Italy, Austria, and Switzerland have introduced this novel legal concept of a moving border, which acknowledges the volatility of these features that were once thought to be stable. And so the process that they use now is to check this border every 2 years to see where the watershed actually is and update the maps accordingly. And interestingly, Italy also shares a border with France, but because of a more contentious history, that same negotiation isn't in place for that particular border. And now I'm just going to show a few more works that are really just the beginning of my delving into this exploration of lines, of shininess, and speculating landscapes. Right now, a lot of this is material and technique experimentation. And again, it's work that's come together in the past couple months. So what I can share of these right now is mostly a collection of ideas and experiments and directions that the work is headed. The mitten piece, if you recall, that incorporated the woodwork from my childhood home, kind of sparked something for me, thinking about not just the geologies from the landscape surrounding my home, but potentially geologies that were in the house itself. So these are chandelier crystals from the chandelier that was in my home that I thought meant we were probably the richest family in town. And they're certainly just very cheap chandelier crystals, mass-produced in the 70s, hanging next to these fossils that I also found in the area that I coated with glass road beads. So I'm also thinking about what shininess tells us about value, and when it does indicate value and when it's an imitation of that. I won't get into this a ton because I think we're coming up on time and I want to leave time for questions. But this piece is made of holographic thread, which has a connection to hyperobjects, which is a concept that Timothy Morton wrote extensively about in 2013. So I'm happy to talk with you at the opening more about that if you're really interested. But essentially, the thing that's happening here when you get close enough is that the definitiveness of all these lines of the mesh of the net start to blur because of the very different ways that it's reflecting light. And this is kind of a new direction for how I'm framing this work. I've been doing it for 6 years and it has 580,000 meshes so far. The goal is to bring it to at least 1 million. It feels like one of the closest things I can do to try to experience a expansiveness of time that I can really bookend as a person. So there's that work. And then this piece is also in the show, allowing weight to kind of stretch some of these lines to become more flexible, to pull out of the strict geometry that they're in. So using light to play across the rigidity of the lines of these pieces, but also the weight and the form. And the last thing that I'll say about this new interest in mirages is a connection to reflection and reflection across time and space. So one of the pieces that I played early on, the Marseille aria, was projected to the ionosphere via harp. I had a friend who was doing a project there, and she put together these curations of works that were sent via radio waves to the ionosphere, and then as they bounced off, they were received via shortwave radio around the world. And so I'm thinking about this this kind of ability to reflect and then arrive in another place versus reflect and arrive back to the same place, as something similar to a mirage that through its reflection, its sort of disorientation, is this slippage in time and space. And this piece that's also in the gallery right now is an early exploration of that. So the design is taken from the magnolia trees that are, or one magnolia tree that is currently in bloom in Binghamton. That mimics the form of a lot of photos that I took when I lived here of the petals from flowering trees kind of collecting on the edges of puddles after a rain. So I'm trying to create this reflection from in space, from here to where I currently live, and also back through time to when I was here. And that's what I have for you, and I would love to hear your questions. I've also been told there's a class that's getting extra credit for asking questions. Sure.
Have you, with your interest in scientific data, climate change, textiles, all of these amazing different layers of your practice, like, have you done any kind of direct? I know you've spoken up some of your collaborations with musicians, and like you were just explaining about sending something to the ionosphere, but have you done any other kind of meaningful cross-disciplinary collaborations with scientists and things that you could speak a little bit more about?
Sure.
If not, that's totally fine too, but I'm just
Yeah. So I was part of creating a research group at SMU with a couple of planetary scientists. That was called something about the expanding Earth. But thinking about like the ways that the definition of Earth is expansive or doesn't contain just maybe this object that we think about. For example, there's like 1 ton, I want to say, this number has left my mind, of meteoritic material that falls to the surface of the Earth every year that we would have classified as not Earth, that now we think of as Earth. So I'm interested in that. And then also like through space debris and trash, the actual physical parameters of the Earth are expanding. So anyways, in this group, it was mostly inviting speakers on a variety of topics. But I also did just get a grant with a couple of scientists and a couple other artists at my university. Binghamton was the place where the lithium-ion battery was invented. And so this is a sort of a very initial part of the project, but we'll visit some lithium mining sites to create some work from this, and also work with these scientists who haven't just stopped with the invention of the lithium-ion battery, that see the issues and are sort of on the move forward. So I'm hoping that will also be a fruitful collaboration. Yeah. Yes.
Who would you say your main inspiration is?
Oh, a great question. My main inspiration. Well, certainly there's many people that I look to, but I'll pick one so that you have an answer to this question. I have been really drawn to the work of William Lamson. I was speaking about one of his projects in a studio visit earlier today, a line describing the arc of the sun, where it's this piece he creates this apparatus with the Fresnel lens and is in the desert, focusing it so that it burns the sand and turns it to glass, and has to keep moving it to account for how the Earth is moving in relation to the sun, and so creates this long arc of melted glass. I think it stands out to me as a very elegant solution for translating what feels like an enormous and hard to pin down kind of relationship between human experience and geology. Yeah. Yes.
Have you ever engaged with indigenous communities or indigenous frameworks during your processes or productions?
That's a great question also. Not directly. Not directly. It's going to be part of this lithium project moving forward, because these mining sites are, many of them have taken over indigenous lands, and one of the collaborators regularly works with communities whose lands have been kind of taken over for different industry applications. But in other projects, no, it hasn't been. All of the projects have really been about sort of my connection or my presence in that landscape in a specific moment in time. So I haven't worked with really any other communities living in these spaces that I've made work in. Thanks. Yeah.
I'm curious with your themes of land and your interest in fiber arts, if you've thought about how your materials connect to the land, or if they don't at all, like using natural fibers. I'm curious if you use natural fibers like wool or plant fibers in your works, or synthetic fibers.
It depends on the piece. One of the works that I just kind of sped by, if I can find it again, these are sequins that are that I laser cut from sheets of mica, and it's stitched with a silver wrapped silk. So all of the elements in this piece, I was thinking really specifically about the materials and about materials that are not plastic based. But that's not, I guess, always the case. Like, in short, no, certainly the mylar is not what I would consider a natural material, and that's something that I've been working with a lot recently. I was just talking about this earlier today as well, that this feels like where my work is headed back to in the future is more of a use of potentially geologic and found materials, but certainly I'm feeling the need to move away from mylar. And I think a lot of that has happened because, honestly, of just the places, the kinds of moves that I've made. When I was living here, I was using a lot of natural and found materials, and then I moved to progressively larger cities where I felt more and more isolated from a geologic landscape. And I think that had a huge role in a shift of materials to more and more synthetic. Yes.
You know, this came up, I'm teaching an art and ecology class, and this came up this week in my class, thinking about place. We spent a week on walking as art practice, and then this week we were talking about place. And one of the students raised their hand and said, this is all so abstract. And I'm really interested in, right, like place is about a specific moment, a specific set of relationships, a specific, right, as you've articulated. And the work is manifest quite abstractly. And I wondered whether you could talk about that, the way that resonates.
Can you say a little more about that?
Well, again, right, like, see, I didn't know how to answer the student, because the student is absolutely right. Like, the work that we were looking at and talking about was quite abstract, even though it was coming out of a very specific type of relationship with place.
Oh, I see.
And so there's a kind of, I think, probably a purposeful drift between the specificity of an experience or a place and then how it's manifest in your artwork. And I wondered if you could talk about that, you know, whether that is an emotional set of deliberations, that kind of distancing, how that like serves you as an artist, either conceptually or otherwise, in relationship to this, again, like beautiful work, but without the conversation, we wouldn't necessarily know the reference points to say the lichen on the rock.
Right.
Right.
I have to say that anytime I've talked about my work to people in a gallery who haven't gotten a talk beforehand, or there's not a statement, I'm really struck by how consistently people come to some of the same reference points just through the kinds of forms that are used, because I'm usually anticipating something like what you're talking about, which is that it's been such an abstraction that it's going to lose these kind of specific moments, but it doesn't seem to, or it hasn't seemed to yet. I think for me the abstraction happens primarily because what I'm trying to do when I'm making work is not to represent the place, but to pull together different times in one place, or different places in one particular time, or trying to capture a range of experiences with light in that place, for example, into kind of one object that puts you in the amalgamation of that. It's different than, I suppose, the data translation pieces, which are maybe it's easier to see that kind of direct relationship. This feels more like I'm offering an impression of the experience that I had in that place, and perhaps providing a parallel experience for viewers without just trying to replicate it. Yeah.
So the outcome is a new experience.
Yeah. Yes. Hi.
The collection is really wonderful to see how the work has evolved. And I always remember it being both really, precise, but always beautiful, something that you didn't possibly expect to in a way. And I wanted to ask you a very process and question about how you scale up the graphite drawings, from the mitten design to scaling up and thinking about space and even just drawing it, and how it's both very precise and imprecise, and all the thinking and the decisions that you make in that process.
It's funny, to be honest, change in scale is part of so much of what I do, and I don't think it's crossed my mind yet that I changed the scale of a mitten so dramatically. I think because it felt like that natural of a leap, I guess, to do that. And again, it's probably connected to, like, all of these mitten designs are dealing with place, are dealing with landscape, which for me to offer that back into a space is to create another kind of enveloping space for a viewer. Is that kind of getting at what you're talking about? Maybe I shouldn't say this on recording, but I don't know why this person necessarily felt the need to share this with me, but my MFA thesis piece, someone said, oh, so-and-so, like, really hates this work because it's so cold. And so it is so precise, and it's something that I honestly struggle a lot in my work, and the kind of work that I'm most drawn to usually are things that are much looser, and much more organic looking. It's a direction that I really attempt to push myself and want to push myself, but it just doesn't come naturally to me. So yeah, this process of like what it's like to be so precise in this work is something I'm fighting against, actually, or hoping to change.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.